Alrighty, so let's use the same system as we did last time, which is feel free to ask questions, but our time is short, and I reserve the right to hold the questions until the end. And I realize, I guess I'm the luckiest teacher in the schedule because I get to have time after my class to answer questions infinitely. So just keep that in mind, okay? But don't censor yourself or anything. Okay, so today's topic is dun 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 the Mabul versus science, problems with the Torah's flood story raised by science and how to deal with them. Okay. Um, I don't think anyone in this group will ask this question, but I've taught this before, and people will wonder, well, why do you need to like raise these problems? Why do we need to do this? So at least three reasons. Number one, we want to understand Torah. Okay, and part of understanding Torah is like answering questions. Okay. Number two, though, here there's a more pressing need, which is Dama Shatashi Apikoros. Chazal say you should know what to answer to a heretic. And this is a big question, or these are big questions that people raise against the divine authenticity of the Torah. And whether or not you are troubled by these questions, then people are troubled by these questions, and it is in your best interest as a boss Torah to be able to answer them. And third is, let's say you don't care about those two. There are certain methodological insights that we're going to get from this that will affect the way that you learn other areas. So I think for all these three reasons, then this is an important topic. All right. And without further ado, let's begin. So brief overview. What is the Torah's claim? What does it say in the Torah as understood by the vast majority of people for all time? Is there was a global flood 4,100 years ago, around 2105 BCE, depending on like how you date things. Wiped out all human life and all animal life on the earth. So not the fish, but the birds and the land animals, except for Noach and his family. Noach then, after the Mabul, reestablished animal life because he had saved, a pair of each species, or at least a pair of each species, depending on whether it was tahor or tameh. And just as all of and all of humanity that we have now descended from Noach and his three sons. Okay, and that is those are the genealogies listed in the what do you call it, in the Parsha. Okay, in Perik Yud, or end of Perik Tes. I forgot where it starts. Okay, so there are, in my mind, four categories of scientific questions or problems with the flood story. Okay, and some are more pressing than others. Okay, so difficulty number one, this is not in any particular order. Difficulty number one is geological evidence. Okay, so if there were a Mabul that covered the entire Earth, there would be ample, like by the biggest definition of the word ample, geological evidence. Okay, for example, there is something, I don't know how much they teach geology in high school or whatever, but strata, right? The different layers of rock. And you can tell what happened, which cataclysmic events happened at certain times. Were there floods? Were there earthquakes? Were there volcanic eruptions? And you could tell by looking at the soil. And analogously to when you cut open a tree and you can look at the rings, you can tell if there was a forest fire because you could tell like that ring is like singed or whatever. And this is a whole science. Okay, this is geology. By the way, a disclaimer here. I am not a geologist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biologist. I am an internet user. And so most of what I got here is from Google searches and Wikipedia. Okay, so take it with as much of a grain of salt as you would with anything else from Google and Wikipedia. Okay. Two, geochronology. Not only can geologists tell what happened, but they could tell when it happened, not to the year, but you definitely can tell the difference between something that happened 50 years ago, 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, and 5 million years ago, and so you can analyze it with the different layers. And geochemistry is you can see, you can analyze the chemical components of the soil and get further data about that and figure out other things. Just to put a picture in your mind here, this is a picture of, or a diagram of different eras of a rock and, or of a rock formation, and you can tell different things that happened at the different times. You can't exactly read this here, but you have, different fossils are found in different things. So plants, animals, animal tracks, shells, etc. And you can tell different things that happen. Okay, and this is the science of geology. Okay, and fourth is sedimentary rock features, which is that when you have cataclysmic events, it shapes rock in different ways. So just as an example, the Grand Canyon, we know, was formed over a very, very long time, millions of years, through gradual erosion. and you can see, even we're not geologists, we're lay people, you can see what that looks like. But then let's say something else. This is Grand Coulee, which was formed by a sudden flood that cut through the rocks. Now, again, I don't understand geology, but geologists do, okay, and they can tell what types of water-based events resulted in different rock formations, okay? And the Mabul would have left similar formations all around the world, or at least, you would have been able to you would have a lot more of them than we would think. So here's the big problem, okay? Big problem is geological evidence of a global flood does not exist. It simply doesn't exist. And in fact, it's worse than simply not existing. Is the geological evidence that we do have suggests that there couldn't have been a flood. Okay, there is a saying that, I can never say this right the first time. Let me see if I can get it. Absence of evidence is not equal to evidence of absence. Okay, meaning just because we haven't, for example, just because we haven't found evidence of Bnei Israel being in the Midbar for 40 years, but that doesn't mean that the event didn't happen. Okay, why? Because you wouldn't expect to find evidence in a desert, of people wandering around. This could be argued, okay, but there are certain areas where, let's say like with geology, where we can study the rocks, and it's not just an absence of evidence, it's based on what we understand about rocks. You cannot say that a flood happened here, okay? And by here, I mean everywhere in the world. Okay, so that's difficulty number one. Any questions on this? Okay, I hear someone on unmute. I just want to make sure that we can mute people. I don't know. I'm going to mute all. No offense if you're... Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, difficulty number two is the ark logistics. This, in my opinion, is the weakest of the questions, but it's also the only question that comes from the text. Okay, so there are estimated to be 6.5 million species of land animals. If you want to know what a species is, ask Aviva or Shana Leah, okay, because they were talking about this when I came in. So if Noach minimum took 2 of each, so that means the ark would have had to hold 13 million animals, okay, and enough food to sustain them for 200 days, okay? Now, you might wonder, could those fit into the ark? So we happen to have the dimensions of the ark, okay? Now, depending on what you say an amma is, we could quibble about that, but let's just say it's 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet, which means it's 1.5 million square feet total. And if you hold by Chazal's statement that the ark was divided into 3 floors and that the animals were on one floor, waste was on another floor, and I think Noach and his family were on another one. So then all of those animals had to fit into a third of it, which is about 500,000 square feet, okay? And he had to gather all of them in 7 days, right? God told him to gather all the animals, and they all came in 7 days. Here is a picture of a 500,000 square foot building. Now, if you wanted to cram 13 million animals into 500,000 square feet, each animal would have to be compressed into an average of 0.46 square inches, and they would have to be mashed in there with no breathing room or moving room, okay? So that's a big problem, okay? Now, yeah. So the problem is it seems unrealistic to say that you can gather 13 million animals from all over the world, okay? Not just in 7 days, but from all over the world into 500,000 square feet with enough food to last for 200 days without miraculous aid, okay? However, the psukim don't mention any miracles, okay? And this is something that has to be acknowledged, okay? Is that even if you want to say that there's a miracle here, the psukim do not talk about miracles in the Noah in the flood story, okay? And in fact, if you say, well, maybe there were miracles involved and the psukim don't mention them, so there are really 2 possibilities here, okay? Some Mefarshim, like Ramban and the Ran and Rabbeinu Bachya, or Bachai, however you want to say his name, they say that there are miracles here, okay? That God made a miracle that allowed Noach to fit all the animals into the ark, okay? However, there are other Mefarshim who say that explicitly that the Mabul did not involve Nisim. The Abravanel says this outright. I'm sure there are more than that, but I just wanted to quote at least one person. But then there are other Mefarshim who, as an interpretive rule, say that the only time you have the right to posit a miracle is if the Torah says it, okay? And Ibn Ezra and Rabag are very hardcore about this, is that, famous example where I first saw this was the Yocheved being born on the borderline between going into Mitzrayim. So the Ralbag and Ibn Ezra both say that if that is when she was born, and if she's Moshe's mother, then basically she would have had to have been older than Sarah was when Sarah gave birth, and that would have been a miracle, and yet the Torah doesn't mention it. So despite the fact that Chazal say that this was a miracle, then they say explicitly that Yocheved giving birth, or that this was a miracle. They deny that it was a miracle, Rabban and Ezra, because they say that the Torah would have mentioned it. Okay, so some say outright there were no miracles, and the others, based on their methodology, say that there were no miracles. And even the ones who say that there were miracles hold by the principle of the conservation of miracles. Okay, I don't know who came up with that title. That's what I call it. That when God does a miracle, he does it in the most minimal way possible. And the Ramban on the Ark, in his explanation on the Ark, actually says this explicitly. Okay, because if God is going to do a miracle to fit all the animals into the Ark, so then the Ramban raises a very good question. He says, and if you'll ask, he should make the ark small and rely on the miracle. In other words, why does Noach need to build a huge ark? If God's going to do a miracle, so then make it this size of a Kleenex box, and then miraculously put all the animals into that. Okay, so what's the answer? Is Hashem saw fit to make it big, to make Noah make it big, in order to minimize the miracle. For such is the way of all the miracles in the Torah or the Nevi'im, to do what is within human power to do, and the rest is in the hands of heaven. So in other words, even though the Ramban says that there was a miracle involved here, he doesn't want to say that, he wants to say that God doesn't want to do a bigger miracle than necessary, So you got two, if you're going to say that this whole thing was a miracle, you got two counts against you. Number one, not all Mefarshim say that there was a miracle. Number two, well, three counts against you. Number two, of the Mefarshim that say that it was a miracle, it was minimized. And number three, isn't it weird that the Torah does not depict the flood as a miraculous event and does not depict the salvation of the animals as a miraculous event? Okay, so that's difficulty number two. Again, this is the least difficult of all the difficulties, but it is a difficulty. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, we got a lot to cover here. And then, by the way, I also want to apologize. This year is a lot less interactive than my usual classes are, okay? But that's just the nature of the beast, okay? No pun intended. Difficulty number three, in my opinion, is the biggest difficulty, okay? Biodiversity. All right, so biodiversity, basic definition is variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. The problem was like this. If all the animals in the world died in the Mabul, except for the pairs on Noach's Ark, so how could those few animals have reestablished biodiversity on their own all over the world in such a short period of time? Okay, so just to fully appreciate this here, okay, so this is I found this, I forgot where I got this on the website, but approximate number of mammal species in the world is around 5,400. And this is a little illustration of the density of different species in different areas. So you see there are lots of different mammals in South America, okay, and also in lower Africa, but not as much in Siberia. Here's a bird diversity, 10,000 species of birds, lots of diversity there. Amphibian diversity, also lots of diversity. Marsupials, not so much, but you got a lot of them clustered there in Australia, okay, and some in South America. Okay, so here are some specific problems. Okay, number one, how could one pair repopulate an entire species on its own? Okay, it's possible, but in that time. Yeah?
I have a question with the premise of the question.
Yes.
Here it says, how could only one pair repopulate the entire species? Maybe it's not like the premise there is that it's repopulating and reestablishing the same way that it was before. Is that so? Because like you can still have biodiversity within the small group that they took, and then that can reestablish a different kind of biodiversity.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it has to be the same ecosystem as before, but what I mean is repopulating the species, not just in isolation, but in harmony with everything else in that ecosystem.
That had been the same before.
Not necessarily having been the same before. It could be even a new one. How can you establish the biodiversity that we see now today?
So it's like the new environment. So they just
right.
I feel like this one,
wait till I'm finished with the question.
Yeah.
Then you can interject, okay. So first of all, how can you repopulate in that amount of time? Okay. And just to compare, and not that this is necessarily, you can dismiss this comparison, but you always hear news stories about finally they got that one male rhino to repopulate with the one female rhino and they save the species, right? And they're trying this for years with all of modern science and technology. Okay, so the fact that they did this on their own, you have to appreciate that. Okay. Number two, how could the species migrate so quickly to establish the distributions we see now? Okay, ecosystems take a very long time to be established. And let's look at this map here. Okay, this is a map of human migration. Okay, so from Africa, this is going on the assumption that humans started in Africa. And this is approximately how long it took them to get to the different parts. So, okay, so for example, to get to the Arabian Peninsula, it took about, they got there about 100,000 years ago. So it took them about 50,000 years to get from Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. Whereas let's say like the last areas in like the Pacific Islands and New Zealand and stuff, humans only got there 1,000 years ago. So it took them 140,000 years to get there. Okay. So the question is like this: is let's say the Ark landed in Mount Ararat, which is in modern day Turkey, ish area. So you got that there. Okay. That one pair of kangaroos, what exactly did they do? Okay, you're telling me that they trekked all throughout the Arabian Peninsula.
Rescind previous statement.
What was that? Yeah, they got through India, got down into Oceania, then hitched a ferry, took it through the islands, got to Australia, and they lived, and then they repopulated all over there, right? Or let's say like the American wild turkey, right? Went from Turkey, went through the frozen Siberia, because turkeys are really equipped to go through like the cold tundra through the biggest stretch of continent. They got to the Bering Sea, which is an ocean, by the way, and turkeys don't swim very well throughout freezing oceans. And then they got all throughout Alaska, and then got down to Muncie, where they still remain today. Like that's not. You can say that they did that, okay? And not only that, but where are they getting food from? Right. So the lions. What do lions eat according to the Lion King? They eat gazelles. Okay, but they eat other animals, right? So the lions got off from Turkey in Mount Ararat, and they went down to the Serengeti. Okay, so let's say you say that they can make it through the Sahara Desert. Okay, what are they going to eat along the way? Well, there's that one couple over there that they're eyeing suspiciously. Okay, which also has to repopulate itself. And by the way, what are those gazelle going to eat? Right, because all the plant life has been destroyed. Okay. And remember, plants don't just sprout up out of nowhere. Everything, the whole idea of an ecosystem is that everything is interdependent. And that really is my third question. How can ecosystems be established in such a short amount of time? Okay. So this, to my mind, is the biggest question. How do you establish biodiversity everywhere in the world in such a short amount of time? And how do those species even survive? I mean, look, one animal dies and then you've lost the entire species. Okay, so very, very difficult question. Okay, let's move on. Okay, number 4, and for some people, this is the biggest question, and I respect that. But for me, I guess I'm approaching it from science. The other question is other civilizations. Okay, if all human beings perished in the flood and reestablished themselves from Noah's sons, so then you got several problems. Number 1, what about all the ancient civilizations that we have continuous records of their existence, not interrupted, going all the way back, and nothing about a flood? So Egypt is one, China is another. Okay, from what I understand, we have evidence of Egypt and China thousands of years continuous, and even going back way before the flood dating. Okay, and you can find ruins, you can find ancient civilizations, even civilizations tens of thousands of years old, right? But even if you don't go back that far, what about these civilizations, right? How do you account for the lack of flood destroying them when you have continuous records of their existence? 2, genetics, different nationalities. Okay, if you and your mom and your dad, okay, had you, and you share certain features, okay, that's genetics on a very simple micro level. However, Chinese people and Nigerian people and Maori people have different genetic makeups. Like they're different nationalities. It's not just like you have Shem and his Shem and Ham suddenly like produce kids who look completely different and have different amounts of melanin in their skin radically, and like have like all these other different things. So where do these different nationalities come from? From 3 people, okay, in such a short amount of time. And not only that, but how could they, similar to the migration and biodiversity problem, how can these descendants of Noah have repopulated and spread out through the entire world in such a short amount of time without miraculous aid? Okay, so how do you account for all human beings? So just to summarize the difficulties, you got geological problems, arc problems, biodiversity problems, and anthropology problems, civilization problems. Okay, these are the questions that need to be answered. Okay, now rather than asking you how you think we should answer it, we just are not going to have the amount of time to do that. So I think there are 4 possible types of answers, and you'll see that I do not think all of these are equally possible. Okay, answer number 1 is you can say that this was all done through miracles. We obviously do hold by miracles, and you can say, yeah, the Torah doesn't say that there were miracles here, but there's no other way to explain it. So we have to posit miracles, and you're going to need to posit a lot of miracles. Okay, just taking the biodiversity problem here, that's, in my opinion, more miraculous than Yetzias Mitzrayim. Okay, the amount of like moving of violations of laws of nature that would have to be done to like reestablish all of that, we can debate about that, but you need a lot of miracles here. Okay. You could say, I don't know. And this is a fair answer. Okay. Not just because there's a question doesn't mean you have to be forced to give an answer. And in fact, if you think that there's a bad answer, it's better to say, I don't know, than to give a bad answer. Okay. So you can say, look, I don't know. And I believe what the Torah says on its face value. And I just can't explain at this point how it happened. Nothing wrong with that. Okay. Third answer, I do not think is a legitimate answer. And I'll explain why. Third answer is the whole flood story is an allegory. Okay. Is a mashal. All right. And it's not meant to be taken literally. Now, I don't think so. First of all, before I say why I don't think you can take it this way, just be aware that, there are certain areas of Sefer Bereshis that we have a Masorah for, that either it's not to be taken at face value or that it's not literal, like Ma'aser Bereshis. We have Ma'aser Bereshis, which is the esoteric way of learning Bereshis. Gan Eden, there are indications in Chazal that it's not literal or not entirely literal. There's no basis in the Masorah for taking this as an allegory. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't take it as an allegory, but in Chazal, Tanaim and Amoraim, no indication that it's an allegory to my knowledge. And not only that, but like none of the Mefarshim take it as an allegory take the story as an allegory as a whole. None that I'm aware of. Okay. Again, that doesn't mean that you can't do it, but it just means you got to be very careful here. Okay. And just to quickly review, man, this is too ambitious of a presentation here. Okay. Saadi Gon says there are 4 reasons to take anything in Torah not literally. So just review them. We're not going to go through examples. Number 1 is if it goes against empirical data, if it goes against the senses. Number 2, if it goes against rationality. Okay. Now that doesn't mean something that doesn't mean common sense. Like it goes against common sense to say that the sea would split, but we hold that it's possible because God created the laws of nature and can manipulate it. Going against rationality, saying that God is a devouring fire, that you can't square that with Yichud Hashem. That's like a square circle. Okay. Number 3, another text in Torah B'Ksav of a contradictory nature. So let's say, for example, 2 statements about how long the Jews were in Mitzrayim. You got to take one not literally. Okay, you have to count it differently. And number 4 is if Torah Sheba'al Peh halachically gives you another explanation, then you have to accept Torah Sheba'al Peh. So eye for an eye means not literally an eye for an eye. 40 lashes really means 39 lashes, etc. Okay, so, but there's no reason to throw out the baby with the floodwater. Okay. No reason to say that the entire flood story is an allegory. So what's the only other option is to interpret the psukim in a manner consistent with science. Okay. Now I wanted to go over the Ramban on the rainbow, but I have a feeling that Mrs. H. Fader will do this in the Lomdeha curriculum, and I don't want to steal that lesson from her. So just note in your mind, file it away, that that's where we get everything I'm about to say. Okay. But those who have learned the Ramban on the rainbow, it is exactly what we're about to do. It's just we're not doing it with the rainbow. We're doing it with these problems. Okay. So there are 2 Mefarshim. Before we go to the Mefarshim, I added this in the last minute. Why aren't these questions dealt with in the Mefarshim, in most of the Mefarshim? So the answer is because most of these questions came from sciences which didn't emerge until the 1800s. Okay, so for example, geology was started somewhere between 1775 and 1830 as a science. Okay, zoology, Aristotle held that there were 500 species of animals total. Okay, now, even if you define species differently, there's a big difference between 500 and 6.5 million. Okay, it's not just a matter of a little bit more. So, and Aristotle was in the 5th century BCE. So all the Mefarshim who followed Aristotle, which is pretty much until the scientific era, they were not bothered by this question. You could fit 500 animals into an ark, and if you can't, then you should do a little miracle, like the Ramban said. But so they weren't aware that there were 6.5 million animals. All right, ecology. The term was coined in 1935, and that's when people started studying it. And if you look before 1935, people were much more cavalier about just dumping pollution into the areas or introducing species into areas and thinking that that's not going to make a difference. So now we know about ecosystems. And then anthropology was also started in the early 1900s. So Mefarshim were just not aware of these problematic facts, and therefore they didn't raise these questions. Okay. However, there were 2 Mefarshim I found who did address these questions. One is David Zvi Hoffman, who was from 1843 to 1921. This is the tail end of the Haskalah movement. He was not Haskalah. He was a student of Rav Hirsch, taught in his school, tackled a lot of the issues raised by modern science and academia. He was around when these sciences emerged: geology, psychology, anthropology, evolution. Facial expression says, "No, I do not want to party." And then there's Rav Gedalia Nadel. So Rav Hoffman, you can view as a forerunner to the academics. Okay. Rav Gedalia Nadel is a recent Rav. Okay. Died in 2004. He was in the Haredi world. He was a student of Rav Shach and the Chazon Ish. okay, the Haredian par excellence in Bnei Brak, okay. He wrote he didn't write. A collection of his teachings was published after his death called B'Toraso Shel Rav Gedalia, and it contained interpretations which tried to tackle these issues between Torah and modern science. And this is from a Haredi Rav. And what happens if you're a Haredi Rav when you write something like this? They put you in Cherem. Okay, they put your book in Cherem. They excommunicate you. Okay, so not popular, but I wanted to bring answers from both of them to show you that that this is coming from two modern Mefarshim from the modern world. Okay, Rav Hoffman's approach I didn't quote inside because Rav Nadel takes the same approach, but he does it in a much more thorough way. So to summarize, okay, and this is the main move. All right, when the Torah says that the Mabul destroyed all life under the heavens, it is only talking about the inhabited part of the world, but not the entire earth. Okay, and by inhabited, Rav Nadel is going to define that in a more precise way. And he shows you, Rav Hoffman shows you that there's a shita in the Gemara that says that the flood didn't reach Eretz Yisrael. And now, not everyone holds that, but you see from that Chazal were open to the idea that there were parts of the world that were not flooded. He's not claiming that Chazal held that the flood was only a local flood, but he's saying that you see that Chazal were open to this. Okay, but let's go to Rav Nadel. And I highlighted a couple of things just to show you how he says it. He says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to wipe out this corrupt existence. However, according to what we've seen, got to move you guys out of the way. According to what we've said, far away from this corrupt society lived many people in the world who were not at all related to those corrupt people, nor to their environment. They were simple people who worked hard for their livelihood, who lived in places far from the east of Eden. There's no reason to think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would also punish them. So this is his first move. God is destroying a corrupt society, but not all the world was corrupt. Okay, for example, hypothetically, my ancestors, the Chinese, right? Before Mao Zedong ruined everything, okay? We're not living a corrupt life, okay, and stealing from people, all right? I don't know if that's true, but that's what he's positing here, okay? Same thing with the people in New Zealand. They weren't doing anything that deserved corruption, destruction. It is reasonable to say that the flood was only in the lands of the Fertile Crescent, but not in other parts of the world. The phrase "from upon the face of the earth" or "under the heavens" is absolutely able to refer to a specific geography, as we'll soon see. Now, he's going to bring an example from Halacha. Okay, but you just look at, for example, look at the Yetzias Mitzrayim narrative. Okay, there it says Kol Haaretz. It's clearly not talking about the entire world. It's talking about the land of Egypt. Okay, under the heavens is a little bit harder because under the heavens would seem to be all the heavens. But he's going to say that he's going to explain it in a second. He says the entire environment in which they lived, to the extent that a man was able to see and apprehend, under all the heavens that he saw, all of this was inundated by the flood waters. But Noach found favor in the eyes of Hashem from all the inhabitants of that corrupt land. Only Noach found favor in the eyes of Hashem. Only he and his household were fit to be saved. So it does not mean the entire world. It means their entire world. Okay, the entire world that they saw, the visible world. Okay, the land does not refer specifically to the entire world. Here, the land is the east of Eden, in which all of the events transpire that are discussed in the Torah. So it's the world of the Torah. It's the land, the setting of the Torah. Here is where the Bnei Elohim engaged in violent robbery, stealing women, and doing every abomination. It is this land which was corrupt before God. So just a picture, that's the Fertile Crescent. So he's going to say that this general area was flooded, okay, but not outside of that, okay, and not necessarily even in Egypt, where again we have evidence of societies there. Okay, so bullet point summary number one is the Mabul only destroyed the society in the land to the east of Eden, but not other parts of the world. Okay, next. I'm going through this very fast because we only got 14 minutes. The Mabul only destroy. Sorry, I just skipped that. Okay. Are all these dimensions of the ark sufficient for all living animals, domesticated and wild beasts, birds, and creeping creatures? That are found all over the globe? Isn't there an immense number of species? Furthermore, animals require a minimal amount of living space. If they overcrowd each other, they will die. But if we assume that the intention was only in reference to the animals found in Noach's land, the land to the east of Eden, then the matter is plausible. So he wasn't gathering all the animals from the world. He's gathering all the animals from his world. And Rav Nadel goes one step further. It is even possible that Noach wasn't commanded to literally bring each and every existing local species into the ark, but only the main species. And this would also be called from all that lives of all flesh. So it might not even have been all of the local animals, but just the main ones. Okay, I don't know if you need to say that, but the point is that it wasn't all the animals in the world. Okay, next. We've already said that under the heavens is in reference to the heavens above this land, the land of the east of Eden, because for the people and the animals in this region, this is the whole world and everything they see and relate to. Now, he brings an interesting proof from Halacha, okay? Take it or leave it. A proof can be brought from this from the Gemara. In Brachos, we learn if a person makes a vow prohibiting all the waters of the Euphrates, then all the waters in the world become asur. Okay, so let's say, for example, if you say that you're taking a vow to not drink waters from the Euphrates River, so that vow will result in an isur for all the waters in the world. Okay, why? So the Gemara says, since the sources of the Euphrates are elevated and all the waters in that region emerge and flow from them, are we to assume that there are no high places in the entire world which are higher than the source of the Euphrates, which do not flow from the Euphrates? Rather, there are such waters. Rather, the expression all the waters in the world certainly means in that entire region in the Middle East. So his point here, it's an abstruse halakhic point that in halakha, the concept of the whole world can mean in a local region, okay? Now, you might object to this, by the way, saying, how can Rav Gedalia twist the Torah's words like this? How can he say that that's tachas kol hashamayim or kol haaretz? So this is my point. He doesn't make this point, but I think it's something important to keep in mind when you learn Torah in general. The Torah uses hyperbole. Hyperbole is when you exaggerate. It's a figure of speech, okay? Rhetorical analysis, okay? And the Gemara says in Tamid, Amar Rabbi Ami, Dibra Torah Lashon Havai, Dibra Nuvim Lashon Havai, Dibra Chachamim Lashon Havai. The Torah, the Nuvim, and Chazal all spoke in hyperbole. And Rashi says here, Dibra Torah Lashon Havai, Ka'adam Sherote Lachazik Devar, like a person who wants to strengthen his words, okay? Which means that when we say Dibra Torah Lashon B'nei Adam, that the Torah speaks in the language of man, that does not only mean that the Torah says God has a hand when he doesn't, it means that the Torah uses human figures of speech, okay? And hyperbole is one. So you can say that the entire word, like, look, in the same way as if you say, you're ruining my life, that's hyperbole, right? You're not ruining your entire life. Or if you say like, look, you take a literal flood example, right? Or a literal natural disaster, when Pompeii erupted and destroyed, when Vesuvius erupted and destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum in Rome, if a person there said like, my entire world was destroyed, you would understand exactly what he meant. Okay, it does not mean, or the entire world was destroyed, because that's his world. Okay, two more points. Furthermore, we have learned, so this is just the point I mentioned before, that Chazal are open to the idea that the entire land wasn't flooded, because they say Eretz Yisrael might not have been flooded. So he just makes that same point there. We see from the Machlokas about whether the Mabul reached Eretz Yisrael that Chazal were open to the idea that the Mabul wasn't global. And then the last point, this is a funny one, okay? What was even Mount Everest covered? Okay, Mount Everest is the tallest mountain. Later on, we hear that the water receded at the end of 150 days, and the ark came to rest in the 7th month on the 17th day of the month upon the mountains of Ararat, which, according to Unklos and the commentators, is in Kurdistan. Why didn't it rest on Everest? Now, I don't think this is a good question, because just because Everest is the highest mountain doesn't mean that Noach's ark was floating anywhere around the Himalayas. So, I don't think that's a good question, but I'm quoting this for the last part. Presumably, it's because the mountains of Ararat are the tallest mountains that were covered by the waters of the flood, since the flood was only in that region, the region of the Fertile Crescent. There, the waters were exceedingly overpowering to the point where the entire region became a giant lake. In other regions of the world, perhaps they didn't even know there was a flood at all. And I quoted this entire thing just for that last statement there, just to show he's saying that it's possible that since the flood was only in this area, other people didn't even know about it. Okay? So now we can answer all of our questions, okay? How do we solve the geological difficulties? So we wouldn't expect to find evidence of a global flood because there was no global flood. It was only a regional flood, okay? And if you have questions about that, we'll get to there in a second, okay? Ark logistics. We can say he did not have to gather all of the animals, but just the species from the portion of the earth that got flooded. And that's entirely possible to fit on the ark without miracles. Maybe we're talking 100 species. Okay, that's very doable. Maybe 50 species. Okay, biodiversity. No need to explain how the Earth's biodiversity and ecosystems established themselves again, because they were never disrupted. Okay, only in this one area did this area get wiped out. And we see this happen all the time, that there are floods that wipe out entire local ecosystems and then they reestablish themselves, and it's fine. Life goes on. Life finds a way, to quote Jurassic Park. Anthropological problems is this flood did not reach the other civilizations, and that's why they have no record of it and were not destroyed. Okay, so those are the responses. Now, we can then, in a one answer, say these difficulties prove that we're reading the psukim incorrectly. We must say that that Haaretz refers to the land inhabited by the Dor HaMabul, not the entire world. Okay, and I wanted to point out something that I was giving this shiur last night also, and Tamar Lichter made the point of, you see from here that these are tremendous problems, but they do not require, the size of the solution does not correspond to the size of the problem. Problems were immense, but it's not like we have to then say, well, everything is a mashal. No, you just have to understand that when the Torah said tachas kol hashmayim and haaretz, that's not the way that you thought it was, and that solves all the problems. Now, just to make sure no one makes a mistake here, undoubtedly, that's the word, right? Undoubtedly, none of the Mefarshim, none of the Rishonim or Chazal held this. Okay, why not? They had no reason to hold this. They had every reason to take the Torah at face value. Okay, because I'm not going to say, oh, this is really what Rashi meant. This is really what Chazal meant. That would be intellectually dishonest. They had no reason to take the Torah as anything other than at face value. Okay, but we now, in my opinion, are forced to say this because I do not think that you can take the notion of a global flood literally because of the answers that I because of the problems here. Okay, so and that's okay. Like it's not like you have to. It's not like the Rishonim were being irrational. They just weren't aware of the questions here. Okay, I do want to point out, and then I'll take questions. Which is that this does not solve all the problems. Okay, and here are 3 remaining questions to be investigated if you choose to go on. Okay. First of all, is there evidence of a local flood? First of all, where was this flood? And what evidence do you have to support this? How did the flood happen? Okay, so for example, if you want to poke around on Wikipedia, there are things about a flood of the Black Sea that happened at around this time, and evidence to support that. Okay, and explanations for how it happened or how it didn't happen. Okay, so you'll have to look into that. I have not gone this far in my investigation yet. Okay, but there should be evidence of a local flood if this is true. 2, ramifications in Torah. Okay, so we are used to thinking of all of humanity descending from Noach via Shem, Ham, and Yafes. If the Mabul did not wipe out all of humanity, so then not all of mankind descended from Noach. What are the theological implications of that? Okay, how does it affect our view of non-Jews versus Jews, of Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, all that stuff? Okay, these need to be explored. Okay, or does it affect that? Number 3 is a question that just was brought to my attention this week by my chavrusa, who is researching this now, but I have not researched it yet. Mega floods. Okay, there is such a thing as mega floods. Okay, and the mega floods are of the proportion described by the Mabul. Okay, for example, the fact he gave me when I said, "What do you mean?" is he said during the last ice age, okay, glaciers covered all of Canada and like down into half of America. Now, here's an astounding fact. How tall were the glaciers? They were 2 to 3 miles tall. Miles, okay? That's a lot of ice, okay? And due to various things that happened, and I think this is also a matter of machlokas among climatologists and like, people who study this stuff, is there were instances where tremendous amounts of ice were converted into water that drastically raised sea levels in certain areas, causing very quick, very big floods. And if, for example, you imagine the Mediterranean Sea, okay, if you can find a lot of videos on YouTube about this, by the way. If you look at mega floods or ice age floods, you'll find videos about this. Imagine the entire Mediterranean Sea. Where are most cities going to be? On the coasts, okay? And if you had floods that raised sea levels tremendously and instantaneously, it would destroy all of society, okay? The problem is that there is no evidence of mega floods of this proportion at the chronology of Noach's time, 4,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago? Yeah. Okay. 10,000 years ago, around there? Yes. So here you have something very interesting, which is flood stories that fit the description of the Mabul, but not the chronology. Now, maybe you'll say, well, the Torah was just recording a story, and really the Torah, the event the Torah describes was one of these mega floods that killed lots and lots of original human beings. Problem is the genealogy. Okay, that we have a genealogy from Adam to Noach and Noach to Abraham. Okay, so how do you contend with that? Open question. Okay, and there's a 4th thing which I didn't add to the PowerPoint, and you may have heard this also, is that there are other stories of floods from other civilizations. Okay, the Epic of Gilgamesh being the most famous one. I think there's a Chinese flood story, and the details are not exactly synchronous with the Noah flood story. what does that say about the Noah flood story? Like, are they all referring to the same event? Are things borrowed from each other? That's another category of questions. Okay, this will be for next year's shiur. Just kidding, Bleednetter. Right? This is what we have to investigate. And if you get one thing from this entire shiur today, is regardless of which answer you accept, the important thing is to strive for truth and not be afraid of the questions. And you might not get an answer this year. You might not get an answer in 10 years. You might die without an answer, right? But you have to be honest and confront the questions and not twist things in an irrational way in order to try to fit your preconceived beliefs and preserve your way of viewing things, even though that's the most comfortable option. Okay, but this is the Das Emes. This is the religion of truth, and we have to strive for truth in everything. Okay, I made it in time. Okay, so sorry again about this being a very one-directional shiur, but I will take questions that you have now. And if you are done, then you may be free to be excused and have a good Shabbos.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay. So, in the aftermath of the flood,
yeah,
right? We talk about the whole thing about like Hashem's promise regarding like future destruction of humanity through a flood.
Ooh, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good point.
How would this interpretation impact how we understand that promise?
Great question, right? So that would be in my remaining question number 2 is, what are the theological implications? Does this mean that God will no longer bring a flood of this proportion to a local region? Does this mean that that God will no longer use a flood to destroy a population of that size because of their chataim? But one could happen just due to other. Great question. I don't have an answer, but I had not thought of that question.
Have we had floods of that proportion that like wiped out an entire civilization?
I don't know.
Like since then?
I don't know.
Okay. Like I don't know. And like when you also mentioned like the geological implications of like it being in like the specific area of the Fertile Crescent, like I have no idea if that's a thing that like.
Yeah. Oops, sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I have no idea also. These are good questions. And look, thankfully we live in an age where I think, look, when I research this, not that I'm doing this in an expert way, but I feel like the information is out there to be able to be aware of, do people even theorize things like this, or is there just no one saying anything like this whatsoever,
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Look, by the way, I encourage everyone to look at the article on mega floods on Wikipedia. That's just a good way to familiarize yourself with like the notion of this.
Okay. Yeah.
If you do say the mega flood thing, though, then you still have all the other problems, like the geological problem, how they all fit on the teva.
Yes, right. But the mega flood doesn't solve everything, but it would account for a larger scale destruction than other stuff. And in other words, it's not just like mega flood versus this theory. Could be elements of it. I guess the reason the thing that led me to the mega flood, or that led my chavrusa to the mega flood theory, is like, when he was looking for evidence about the local flood, then he found all these mega floods, and then he found the problem of chronology, is that they were earlier than the Torah dates.
Were the mega floods happening in the same geographic area, or was that more like? Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's the YouTube videos will do a good job of showing that.
Because I was learning about peopling of the Americas and how like they're like that quote unquote land bridge. There was like a whole like civilization of people that's theorized to have lived, which then the mega flood came in. I can't remember the name of it right now.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, one question which I didn't touch upon, which is, I think, related to this, is all of this also goes back to, what do you make of Adam and Chava? Now that we know so much about anthropology and humans, and that kind of it is a separate question, but it's interwoven with the chronology of Adam and Noach. That's its own outstanding problem.
We learned about that a little bit with Mrs. Fader and me, and we were in 12th grade. And it was kind of like that there are like diversity of peoples. Like maybe it was like the first man that could have the potential to recognize God as opposed to the other ones, which like,
Right. Now I'll just, in the interest of truth, in the interest of truth, there are theories out there that if you that there was an event of the flood, that again, because this is present in other people's cultures. In fact, let me show you a cool tool.
I'm thinking of taking in a literature class that's going to be studying like Epic of Gilgamesh and like all of the other flood stories. Like there's a lot of flood stories in the region.
Yes. So I'll show you. So this
What
was
we make
I
of
had
that, I
a
don't know.
I was privileged to have a meeting, private meeting with the creator of alhatorah.org, who showed me, he gave me a tour of all the features, or a bunch of the features. So if you go to alhatorah, actually, I'll show you the easy way to get here. There's several ways. Oh, actually, all right, sorry, the easiest way is you go to alhatorah. Let's just do English, so you can see the English. Okay, so you scroll down. Oh, actually, it's up here. Parsha topics. Click on Parsha topics, and you have all the parshios. So click on Noach, and let's say we go to the Mabul and Mesopotamian myths. Okay, you're seeing my shared screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you have a little summary here: Epic of Gilgamesh, Epic of Atrahasis, Epic of Ziusudra, and you have a whole article about it. But you can go like this and get all the sources that are relevant to Tanakh. And here's the cool thing: here's a table, and you can compare the hero of the story. So who was it according to each of them? So in the Sumerian account, it was Ziusudra. In Babylonian account, it was Atarasis. Babylonian account, Untapishtim. Torah is Noach. Placement in primeval history. When did it occur, right? And why did it occur, right? And you can compare all these things. So that's a research tool at your disposal. It's pretty cool.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. And again, I encourage you to explore in this tool in general. They have all of these topics in every parsha, that you can click on and explore. And they have lots and lots of stuff at your disposal. You're not gonna go to sleep every night, Shayna, Leah. But anyway, so anyway, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because there are people who will say, and again, this is a new theory, okay, and some might consider this to be kafira. I'm just gonna throw this out there, okay, that there was an event, or that there was a myth of a flood and a person who was saved, and it was regarded as history back then, okay? And rather than trying to deny that myth or that history, the Torah adapted it and then instilled it with its own values in order to frame the origins of mankind in a way that's conducive to human perfection. So for example, instead of saying, I didn't read through those articles, but let's say instead of saying there was a flood because the gods were fighting with each other, or there was a god because the king used magic and brought a flood upon people. So if in the ancient world everyone believed in these things anyway, okay, then the Torah is not going to try to go against that, but the Torah will say that no, it was God destroyed the world because mankind was acting unjust, and it will polemicizing the Torah's the myth essentially through Torah lens. Now, what does that say about the historicity? So there are going to be people who say that the event actually happened. That's how all the myths came up, and all of the myths were reactions to this real world event. Some people will say that no, it was just a myth, and the Torah works with that myth. And then you still have to account for the genealogy, because obviously we do hold that Abraham was a real person. And if you're tracing his genealogy back to Noah, so then what happens? Like, I don't know about you, my grandfather was not an allegory, my grandfather was a real flesh and blood being. So at what point does it become that,
But then you're taking the whole thing as a mushal. So it's like you're
right. So that according to that approach, you'd be taken as a mushal. And I'm not compelled to accept that right now. Just because I see no need to do that, but I just want to say that there are people who do that, just not classical mafarshim,
Why
I
can't
just
you
wish. Oh, sorry. Go for it.
why can't you mess with the idea that time in the Torah is not exactly as we see it now? So if you think of it as that this story happened before all of humanity spread out across Pangea or whatever, and before it spread out, then it happened in a small region before there were a ton of animals all over the world, and then it's possible.
Well, you'd have to make sure that that's correct. For example, Pangea happened way before any human beings, or even dinosaurs were. I think you have to look at the chronology. So you have to work out the particulars. But here's the other thing also, though. If you look at Parashas Noach on Al Torah, then they also have a thing about the chronology of the flood. Okay, so here's where I think you would find. Well, I guess this is a different kind of chronology. Then this is how long the flood took. You're
It's
saying
also looking into how the chronology is being established, meaning there are like relative chronologies, and then there are
right.
ones that are based on isotopic analysis. And depending on how it's, what's it called? How it's tuned, like, you know, you get different.
Yeah. So
years.
Leah, the answer to your question is in principle, then yeah, that would be a viable route to explore. But the question is, does it play out? Yeah. Shane Lee, you had a question also.
Yeah, it's just so interesting how the Torah sometimes does and doesn't take in like early contextual stories or doctrines or ideas that were established at a time, as
Yeah.
opposed to presenting it as time in a timeless way. Like I think something that I continuously struggle with is using the anthropogenic terms, like the hyperbole that we spoke about with Tamid 29a, when and when it isn't applied and is applied. I just wish it appeared more outside of appealing to our mind so that we can understand it, but then also like away from where we can corrupt it.
Right. So this is one of the,
corrupt.
this is one of the awakenings that I've had in the last couple of years about the Torah is eternal, but it was also given to people who were in a particular time period. And the biggest example of this in the Mefarshim that you're familiar with is the Rambam's view on Korbanos, right? That,
right. Yep.
that the whole system of Korbanos was geared towards the era of mankind when they were attached to Avodah Zarah. And if God had given the Torah today, there would be no Korbanos. So you got this thing where the Torah is eternal, Korbanos don't go away. Like we're still going to bring Korbanos in the Yemos Mashiach. And the ideas that we learn from them are still eternal, but it was crafted for that specific era in mankind. And you know, and which God knew would last for a while, but it was designed to get you out of that, you know? So, and just to borrow an example from that, you know, people will accuse that of being an imperfection, okay, of Torah. They'll say like, well, if the Torah is perfect, it should be relevant in the same way for all time. So here's my response to that, okay? The Torah is against the Avodah Zarah, right? Can we all agree? Okay, yeah. There are 50, according to the Rambam, there are 51 mitzvos d'oraisa designed to uproot Avodah Zarah. Now, let's say everyone in Klal Yisrael follows all those mitzvos. And let's say we do our job as being a light unto the nations and we spread it to Bnei Noach. And let's say that we eradicate the entirety of Avodah Zarah from the earth, okay? Now, fast forward, if you point then to those mitzvos and say, well, why would God prohibit us from bowing down to idols? No one does that.
Right.
Therefore, the Torah is imperfect. No, my friend. The fact that the Torah succeeded in eradicating an Avodah Zarah shows the perfection of the Torah, you know?
That's beautiful.
Yeah, right. So the thing is that's why I'm not bothered by the Korbanos thing that the Rambam says, is that yeah, it was designed for a certain era of mankind when they were attached to Korbanos, and you see that it worked, right? Like because, you know, you can ask history people how this happened, but really, you know, Judaism spread monotheism throughout the world, which then caught off like wildfire with Christianity and Islam. And the vast majority of the Western world does not bring Korbanos doesn't bring Korbanos anymore and doesn't do pagan Avodah Zarah anymore. You know, that's the success of the Torah. And the fact that you can point to Molech and Ovi, Adoni, and say, well, those things are not around, that's a sign of the Torah's success. So similarly, if the Torah addressed itself to certain periods of mankind in their understanding of the world, or hijacked certain mythologies in order to infuse them with things that allow people to get past the primitive, that is a sign of the Torah's perfection, not the sign of the Torah's imperfection. I have an article which I'll send you. I can't remember if I've shared this with you in the past, of how I teach Sefer Beraishis, and none of you have been in my Beraishis class. But essentially my approach, I'll summarize it. Essentially my approach is we go through Beraishis and then we take a look at the ancient myths of creation from other societies and show how the Torah was trying to, the Torah is not trying to give a scientific account, according to me. The Torah is trying to create a worldview that is anti-magic and anti-myth and lends itself to a scientific way of viewing the world. And it's combating the mythological pagan ways of viewing the creation story. So it was addressing that mentality. And if God wrote the Torah today, he would combat scientific new atheism, like as the thing, and so that's so I'm comfortable. So again, this is only for me in the last couple of years, is in the same way that the Rambam applies this to korbanos and mitzvos. I'm starting to realize that the narrative portions of the Torah are doing things like this as well. And Shane, the book I recommended to you, which I would recommend to all you guys also, I wouldn't recommend this to everyone, but what is it called?
I have it written down.
You have it written down? Yeah.
I don't know where that paper is now, though.
Well, let me just go get it. I'll be right back.
If only we still could talk. God could still talk back. Right? I feel like that's like constantly where it comes down to.
Like, hello? Like
we have new knowledge that he enabled us to get. Like science. I mean, like modern science anyway.
Here it is. I got it.
Want a sequel.
Yeah. So again, this book is not for everyone, and I think for some people it would actively be harmful. Ani Ma'amin by Joshua Berman, who is an Orthodox academic, Orthodox Jewish academic, who tries to defend Torah with the 13 Ikarim against the secular academics or biblical criticism, and at the very least, read the first chapter. Because he has I forgot it was the introduction to the first chapter, but he does a good job of like showing you a methodology for how to grapple with these issues. And I haven't read the whole book yet, but the parts that I've read are good. Yeah.
Can I ask like a weird question?
Sure.
Those are the best.
Okay. What? No, just because, okay. If the Torah, like the narrative portions, are trying to, I guess, combat the narrative, like of like the mythologies from other cultures.
Yeah.
If it wasn't actually truth, the things that were coming, like maybe it's a better way to think about it, but like if it wasn't actually truth, aren't we just creating like our own cultural mythology, which is not true? Like maybe, yes, it's like rooted in like good ideas, but isn't it just like creating like yet another like mythology? And I don't like believe like that. I'm just like playing that, you know what I'm saying? Like I don't think that all of the narrative is like fake, but
so let me I'll answer your question in two avenues. One is it false to say that God took us out of Mitzrayim with a Yad Chazaka and a Zro Natuya? No, right? So even though God doesn't have a hand, right, that is an effective way to convey ideas about a non-physical being. So even though the actual content is strictly speaking false, because it's being used as a way of arriving at the truth, then we call that way of talking true, right? Similarly, the example I give before of like, if I told you, we all know the story of the boy who cried wolf, right? But if I told you that boy never actually existed, that does not change the truth value of the story, right? Because the whole idea of that genre is that it is not intended to convey a report, a factual report, historical report, right? So the question is, would you say such a thing about, let's say, the creation account, right? Like, is that in the same vein, or is that not? Because I'm claiming that it is, because it is that the Torah was addressing people who were living in a world where it wasn't a competition between magic and science. It was a competition between this magic and that magic, or this mythology and that mythology. So the most the Torah can do, and if the Torah said, hey guys, quantum physics, that would not have done anything for the advancement of a human being, right? So the most the Torah can do is establish a different, if you want to call it a myth, right? Then you could call it a myth. I'm not comfortable with that language.
I'm like so tentative with that question.
Yeah, I don't like that, because to me, so a myth, the way I define a myth, if you put me on the spot and said define this for the first time, like I haven't defined it yet. Myth would be to explain I can't define it right now, but I sense it's different.
Story with moral.
Yeah, story with a moral, right? Usually it has a moral means. But what I'm saying about this is a different type of thing. The Torah is trying to get you to think about the universe in a certain way. Like, I'll just give an example. I mean, you'll see this in the article I can send you, but like calling the universe malacha, okay, using that mashal is we don't realize how revolutionary that is. What is malacha? It is lawful design that underlies matter. Okay. And other nations said that God laid an egg and the universe came out of the egg, or the male God and the female God like had sexual relations and then she became impregnated and then the baby like vomited and then the world came out. So what are you going to do? Or let's say like the God made the world out of clay, you know? So what are you going to, if you're a person in prehistoric or, you know, a primitive man, right? Are you going to view, if you're viewing the world as something that came magically from an egg, or you're viewing the world as malacha, which one is going to lead you to science? You know,
Right.
like leading the world, you know, or
Right.
let's say, for example, like the idea, another example that I highlight in this is what celestial object did almost all ancient societies worship? The sun, right? The sun is a god. What does our Torah do? Not only is the sun not a god and it's a creation of God, but it was created on day 4. Okay.
Right.
It's demoting something that people viewed as the God or the thing, you know, human beings being viewed as the children of gods, right? That's how a lot of these stories are, right? So we are created on the same day as land animals. We're a category of land animal, you know, but we have the Tel Elohim. So like, I don't view that as the same as a myth. You know, this is not a myth in the same way as like when you tell a, you know, like when you tell a little kid who doesn't understand death that, you know, grandma passed away and she's in a better place, you know, that's not a myth.
Can you elaborate on the question?
Hold on a second. That's not a myth. That is explaining it on the level that the person can understand, that's conducive to a more mature understanding. That's like saying God's eyes are watching you, or God smelled the fragrant aroma of the korban, you know, or God got angry. Like it's in that category, you know. Shayla, the question was Aviva's question. Tell me if I'm getting this wrong.
I was going to ask a question on top of the question.
Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to understand if the question was about creating new myths, and those new myths are interpretations that which Chazal didn't address in Torah Shabbat Peh, meaning if Torah Shabbat Peh, oh, it wasn't? Okay, so then I have...
No. Let me try and restating your question. You tell me if this is what you were asking. Is if the Torah is creating its own, whatever you want to call those things, myths, you know, things that are not on the surface level true, but are designed towards truth, then aren't we just, then the question is like, what is the truth value of that? And are we just replacing one myth with another, or is it is the Torah doing something else? And the way I'm trying to explain it, if you can tell, is it's a pedagogical technique that the Torah is using on a species-wide scale. So I'd say it's not the same thing as what myths are doing. Myths are like in a vacuum that you create a story about Orion's belt in order to teach a lesson, or you just fabricate something in your imagination, you know, or you know, but it is similar to the myths in the sense that it has an agenda. It's just that the agenda is not serving human needs, or it's not serving to justify pre-existing beliefs, you know, or to address primitive fears. It's serving to advance mankind towards a Tselem Elohim society, you know.
Would that be an Agadita then?
I think Agaritas are not doing that. That's my understanding of Agaritas. You know, maybe certain Agaritas that are there for moral reasons. Let's say, for example, like there's a shiur in the YBT tape audio library, which was Rabbi Chait doing a Q&A for 4th graders. Okay, and it was just very interesting hearing him. I think it was it was either 4th graders or 7th graders. I know there's a big difference there, but I'm questioning myself now.
That's okay.
7th graders. Okay, I think it was 7th graders, and I think one of the questions was, what is a tzaddik? Okay. Now, if you ask me that, I would have my definition. If you ask any of your teachers that, I'm sure they have definition. And I was shocked. Rabbi Chait's answer to the 7th grader was, a tzaddik is someone who lives like Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Okay. And for the first time, I realized, oh, that's what the Midrashim are doing when they say that the Avos kept all Taryag mitzvos. Okay. Clearly, any rational being knows that you can't say that the Avos kept all 613 mitzvos, and people go further. They say that they kept all the Derabanans and all the Minhagim. You know, no, they weren't. Abraham wasn't baking matzahs because of a Pesach Seder for the Exodus that hadn't happened yet, and Yaakov Avinu wasn't raised to not eat the Git Hanashed because he's going to later on wrestle with an angel that's going to, right. But and none of them built the base Mikdash, none of them destroyed Amalek, but what's the idea of saying that the Avos kept all of the Torah? At least on a level that you're asking about, Shane Alea, is that that when you tell kids these stories about the Avos, you want them to picture the righteousness of the Avos on the same continuum as the righteousness that they are striving for. The Avos are designed to be role models. So it would be at odds with that purpose if you depicted Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov as not keeping the Torah, and therefore, like, we tell kids that the Avos kept Kol Torah Kula, and then when they're more mature and they realize that, it doesn't logically make sense to say that they kept every mitzvah in the Torah, then they're ready for another interpretation, So those midrashim, I think, Shane Alea, are fulfilling that sort of pedagogical, like developmentally appropriate agenda. But I think the other midrashim, like Sason and Simcha, like, no, that's not trying to establish like a pedagogical, like, level appropriate thing. That's just like a straight up allegory,
So what do we do now, like with, I don't know, when we were talking about the Mabul, I'm going to think about this question more.
Can I ask, like, this is going back again to like the whole like myth versus like, I don't know, like, I'm not entirely sure what my question is. I just know that like I'm bothered, but and that's okay. Like, I'm okay with that. But Shane Alea, you might actually know, I don't know if you know the answer to this question also, but Shane Alea, like, it's been like 2 years since I've taken cultural anthropology, but what do they call it? Like a creation myth, or like they talk about like that a culture will have it to like justify the way that they live their lives. So like, could this be like an intentionally created, as in like adding to the perfection that we were talking about of like how Torah, let's say, would like eradicate avodah zarah through like the way that, so like, could this be like an intentional construction of like a cultural mythology that justifies our way of life, like that?
I'd say it does something else. Okay, and this is, I think, where the Torah differs, is it's not justifying a way of life, it's criticizing our way of life. It's designed to proactively shape us into something that this is not like,
because Torah is about like constant improvement and striving towards like a particular path.
Yes.
So like, instead of justifying the way that we do things, like molding us to be better, and that this would like kind of like not the opposite of like other cultural mythology. I don't know what the term is called.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about though. Yeah.
They say that like all cultures have like that basis for like going forward, but okay, sorry.
Yeah, and just to be clear here, right? Okay, I only hold that these are even possibilities in the realm of like the prehistory part of the Torah, right? We're not talking about right? Yeah. I just want to clarify that. Yeah. But is that people are prone to doing Hamas and to doing avodah zarah and to doing arayos. So the Mabul doesn't justify that; it aims to uproot it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or maybe it justifies the better system of like trying to eradicate these negative character traits and like push towards a more moral life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And again, if you look at, let's take Greek mythology as an example of this, you look at what the Greek gods did. Okay. So the Greek gods were involved in drama and like adultery and murder and arrogance and all this other stuff. Okay. And then you look at the first parak of Beraishis, okay? And if you looked at what are the only things that God does, he creates, he looks at things and says they are good, right? He
engages with his creations and asks some questions about their morality and
right. Okay. So in other words, if you just took the face value of the Torah story and you said, what kind of supreme being are you looking towards, and you compare that to the Greeks, like it results in two different societies, one that values knowledge and like creation and productivity and all that other stuff.
Like, what is our model of perfection that we strive for? Like, is it being angry and like taking revenge and being petty, or is it like benevolence?
Exactly. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
And I don't even go for the whole like, Beraishit is like a myth type thing. Like that's not even, but like, I love that we can have that discussion anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I also think it's, this is a good methodology thing in general, is like, even when you don't agree with a particular approach or opinion, recognizing whether you don't agree with it because it's crazy, or you don't agree with it because like it makes sense and it's plausible, but you just don't agree. You have reasons to not agree with it, you know. And I think that's, even if you don't agree with this, I think realizing that it's not crazy, you know, is a good thing. Yeah,
I love it. It's amazing. So
yeah.
thank
So then in that case, I think you'll like the article that
Almost like we live our lives by it.
Yeah. Alrighty.
you.
So if you have questions, feel free to email me.
There's a lot to think about this, Shabbos.
Yeah, a lot to think about.
I'm so excited to show all the Torah.
Share, you should not share these ideas with everyone, right? Like I think for certain people, you know, don't go to your 11-year-old sister and say, "Hey, do you think the flood happened?" You know, like
told us that in Torah how you have like 3 different ways of engaging an answer to a question, like seeing someone's like where they are emotionally, where they are philosophically.
Yeah.
And then gauging the answer to
exactly.
that.
And that's why like you know, I taught this when I taught Beraishis in Shalhevet, and the main reason why I taught this as part of my high school curriculum is because if you don't hear this from me, you're going to hear it from someone. And if you're hearing it from your secular anti-religious college professor, you will not have answers and you will not be prepared for anything. So better to hear this from me than someone else. But for your 8-year-old sister, or for your frum person who is secluded from the world, I don't think that this question, first of all, I don't think they have the framework to be able to handle it in a way that's not going to be overly distressing. And I also don't think it's high priority for them if they're not going to be encountering these types of things in real life. But for this audience, then I definitely think it's relevant.
I still feel like when I have conversations with people that, you know, the ones that like believe everything is false and like that there's no value in Torah, that sometimes like, and they're like the intellectual elite mentality where like they're like all when, you know, they believe in their science and science devoid of God. I don't know how to engage on that level and show them, you know, I almost just want to send them the shiur. Like look at this, like this.
Here's the interesting thing.
Like, logic when people don't see the logic.
Well, here's the thing, okay? I'll tell you how they would view this shiur. Okay, this shiur does not demonstrate anything about the chachma and benefit of Torah. Okay? In other words, I don't think you need to answer this question in order to get the benefits of the flood account that God wanted you to get. Okay, the flood story was incorporated into Chumash, regardless of what actually happened. The flood story was there to teach us midos and deos, you know, and some mitzvos, right? So you're not actually showing them the chachma of the Torah from this. That's why I framed it also as a damash tashiv la'apikoros, or we have to fully understand the story, you know. But this is not the type of thing that would really show an atheist the chachma of Torah. If you're having a discussion with an atheist and you want to show them the chachma of Torah, so then like the thing I would focus on is not how to answer questions against the veracity of Torah. I would show them like mishle ideas, or I would show them like values, or, you know, like there's this great the article I'm going to send you that I wrote. The whole thing was inspired by this book called, I'm just trying to look for it, see if I have it out. I have a link to it in the article because you'll see it there, by this guy named Leon Kass, who is a secular academic, but he takes what he calls a wisdom-seeking approach to reading Genesis. Okay, and he lays out his premises in the beginning, and he says basically like, we're going to assume textual unity. We're going to assume that the text was designed to give insights into human nature and into how to live. And we're going to approach it in that way and look for ideas like this, you know. And there are other people who do this as well. I don't agree with all of his ideas, but Jordan Peterson is someone on YouTube who has a whole lecture series on Beraishis, and trying to get ideas from it, because basically he says like, look, whether or not you hold by the divine origin of the Bible, and I don't know what he actually holds by it, these are stories that have guided mankind for for ages, and there's values and wisdom there, you know. And it's the same way that I don't believe that Taoist scripture is divinely given. I don't even know what Taoist scripture is, but could there be chachma there? Yeah. So
when the value isn't expressed, meaning, so if we're the starting point is that there's value in it, and therefore for the point of the conversation of engaging out, because getting into the how it got there and whether it's divine is irrelevant for that conversation.
Exactly. Yeah.
At the starting point, and but then when they combat the value itself. Yeah. So for example, if they start like, where are they poking holes, and then like how you address which holes they're poking, it's different.
So that is very tough, and it often is tough because you're coming from different premises, and you have to be able. Yeah. You have to be trained in seeing what is what is a particular and what is an underlying universal, and like being able to address the universals. And that's sometimes hard to
maybe
see.
setting premises. I think when I engage in conversations with like my Muslim friends or like atheist individuals, like when we talk about the premises, we always try to like what we're coming in with, expecting and then engaging with that, because otherwise you can be using the same words and meaning something completely different.
Yeah, exactly. FYI, and I'll say this also, I gave this shiur last night at YBT, and I'm going to post that on YouTube. I'm not going to post this discussion because I don't think this discussion is for everyone, but I'm going to upload it to YouTube, but I'm just not going to make it listed. So if you ever want to like review this discussion, it'll be there. It just won't be searchable because I don't think the discussion is for everyone.
Thank you. And I appreciate that, because I'm sure when I listen to this back, I'm going to have more articulated questions.
Okay, sure. All right. Thank
you so much.
Good Shabbos, everyone. And I'll send you the stuff. Okay. Yeah, have a good Shabbos.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.